Blackmyth Wukong is a really good game, it's just not a really great game, and I mean Game of the Year great game. I would even go so far as to say that it's slightly overrated, and with the fact that it got a 96% approval rating on Steam over a 92% rating for arguably one of the greatest games of all time, Elden Ring, I don't think I'm crazy in saying that. Like off the rip, if you played both of these games, it is so much harder to pinpoint where Elden Ring goes wrong compared to where Blackmyth Wukong does. Now obviously I'm not saying Game of the Year has to be perfect because previous winners like Elden Ring and even Baldur's Gate do have flaws as well, but none of them are glaring ones like what I experienced in Blackmyth Wukong. Now before I get too negative, of course I have to give credit where it's due because for Game Science's first AAA game, they did a fantastic job, and I've got to say, this game has some of the best experiences in gaming I have ever encountered, mainly with the boss fights, but it also has some of the most annoying immersion breaking experiences, with one of them being something I haven't experienced in over a decade back when I was a youngin', and I will touch on that shortly. So quickly, before I get into the reasons for why I think Blackmyth Wukong won't win Game of the Year, for all of you gamers out there that get high sodium levels when your favorite game is criticized or you don't want this game to be spoiled, now is your chance to click away. If you've already played the game, then you probably saw this coming. Well actually, no you didn't, because it's invisible. I'm talking about the invisible walls. Now normally I wouldn't criticize a game for having these because usually it's few and far between, but for a game on a next gen console in 2024, I was genuinely surprised at how many invisible walls are in this game. Like, I honestly don't think I've seen this many since the PS2 days, and that's actually saying something. To explain, whenever you are Wukonging around any of the chapters, you will constantly see openings in structures, cliff faces, or even doorways, and it will literally look like you just found a secret passageway only to find out that it's just a wall. You would also quite often find invisible walls stopping you from going down ledges, which initially was fine, but then every so often there would be a ledge you could just fall off and die, so it just made no sense because there was no way to differentiate between the two. Oh, and on top of that, occasionally you would encounter out of place invisible walls during combat or even just normally when running around, and it would just take you out of the whole experience. Now, of course, invisible walls are not the be-all end-all for Game of the Year, but when you encounter as many as I did, you really start to become aware of them to the point where your immersion is constantly interrupted and it just makes for an inconsistent experience. Oh, and I feel like I just have to say this, but Final Fantasy Rebirth, a game that also came out this year, from my memory, I don't even think I noticed a single invisible wall in it, so if I had to guess, it's probably gonna win on the immersion front alone. But anyway, back to Blackmyth Wukong. What makes this an even bigger issue in this game is what happens when you pair this with the next point. Level design in Blackmyth Wukong isn't good, but it isn't bad either. It's literally just average, and I found traversing it to be a bit of a pain in the ass. There were two reasons for this, but the first thing I gotta say though is the levels themselves look visually really impressive. However, and here's the first reason, at the same time a lot of the stuff within the levels all kinda looks the same, and there isn't exactly a large variety of landmarks to guide you, so you at least know you are heading in the right direction. On top of that, the invisible wall issue I just mentioned does not help the situation at all, because you might think you found the right way to go when in reality you just found an invisible brick to the face. I just wanted to point this out, but if you need any reference for how much further the level design in this game could go, even if it's linear, just play any of the FromSoft games, because I personally think that Blackmyth Wukong isn't even close when it comes to this. Anyway, the issue I had with this was I found it difficult to tell what areas I had been to and what areas I hadn't, and I honestly felt kinda lost in some of the chapters, especially in the long ones like chapters 3 or 4. What I can also add to this is that because they were so long with little variation, that feeling of repetition also starts to set in. Now, the second reason complements this and could actually be a fix if implemented, I'm talking about a map. Now, normally I would say a game that's this linear wouldn't need one, but for the things I just mentioned and more, it kinda does. A big thing I tried to do in this game was backtracking, and that's because there's a lot of missable stuff, but I cannot express how much time I wasted running around trying to figure out where to go, so a map hands down would have made this so much easier. What also emphasizes this is that some parts of the chapters become less linear and more open with little to no bearings. Then it becomes even more obvious when you get to chapter 6, which is basically open world. Like, I literally thought chapter 6 is a taste of what Elden Ring would be like without a map, so I don't want to hear any bullshit about Ubisoft and maps, because that game needed one, and so does Blackmyth Wukong. So this point is basically about minor issues I experienced in the game that individually wouldn't be a problem but collectively bring the quality of the game down. The first thing I want to touch on kinda had me questioning my sanity, and that is the input delay. To quickly explain, throughout the entire game, I encountered all these instances where I would push a button to either heal, use a buff, or even pause the game, and what would happen was I would either do the action 2 seconds later or no action would register at all. Now, I already know people are gonna say, just don't button mash bro, but for a start, I'm incredibly meticulous when it comes to this, and honestly, the only time I button mash was to get the game to register what action I was trying to do. Now, it's not like this happened all the time, but it did become an annoying occurrence because the game clearly demands quick reflexes, but it also feels like the game itself can't keep up, and you just end up dying while thinking to yourself, I swear I pushed that button. Speaking of combat, the other minor issues I wanted to add to this were that the camera or lock-on clearly struggles with keeping up with fast enemies, and if an enemy goes out of view before an attack, there will be no way to tell where and when it was coming. If you want to know a game that has a solution for this, just play God of War, because whenever an enemy goes out of screen in that game, there's an indicator telling you where it's coming from. Anyway, back to Wukong. For me, these things all just added artificial difficulty, which was frustrating, and it kind of hindered what would otherwise be insanely good combat. Oh, and I feel like I just have to say this, but this isn't a skill issue. I actually found this game quite easy, at least compared to FromSoft games, which is what I'm used to. Anyway, another minor issue I wanted to add here is the performance. Now, normally I can tolerate the odd frame drop and stutter, but these happened frequently enough where it was something I was aware of. I also had random graphical issues every so often, and my game crashed a few times, which was just straight up annoying because one time it literally happened against the final boss, and that just pissed me off. This is something I would justify for a new company making a game, but you can kind of see that on their own, all these little issues aren't much to talk about, but when they all add up, it seems to indicate one thing, to me at least, and that's a lack of polish. Now look, even though I've been purposely negative about the game so far, it is still a really good one, but if you think about it in the grand scheme of things, most of the games that win Game of the Year don't really have all these issues, and the same can be said for games that have already came out this year. Anyway, I still love this game. I'm very interested to see what Game Science does next. Apparently there's 2 DLCs coming, I'm definitely getting those, but if it wins Game of the Year, I will be slightly disappointed. Thanks for watching, look after yourself, and I hope this video made you go, yeah.